when a terrified little girl silently flashes a rescue signal in the middle of a crowded street. Keanu is the only one who notices. Without a second of doubt, he rushes to her side, confronting the danger she can't speak about. In moments, a stranger's quick courage turns her secret fear into safety, hope, and a second chance. For years, people have quietly shared small stories about Keanu Reeves. A fan remembers him waiting in the rain after a rap party to talk to the last security guard. Someone else recalls him giving up his seat on a crowded subway without making a show of it. There are photos of him carrying equipment on film sets, chatting with crew members like old friends, staying behind when everyone else has gone home. None of these stories are spectacular on their own. They're just small moments where he seems to notice another human being and respond without hesitation. People like these stories because they feel like proof of something we want to believe. That kindness can live comfortably inside a busy life, inside fame, inside exhaustion. That a person who could easily ignore others instead chooses again and again to look up and pay attention. The title you clicked on, about a little girl, a rescue signal, and a man who didn't wait a second, sounds like the kind of scene we might easily picture him in. A child in trouble, a quiet signal, someone like Keanu stepping forward. But this story doesn't happen on a movie set or a Hollywood street. There are no cameras, no red carpets, no security teams in the background. The man at the center of it is not famous. He's someone you would walk past without a second glance, just another tired face in a city full of them. His name is Armin. He is 43 years old, and he works at a small printing shop in the middle of a noisy downtown. It's the kind of place that does business cards for realtors, flyers for local bands, church newsletters, and last-minute school projects. If you saw him there, you might notice his careful way of aligning paper stacks, the small pencil behind his ear, the faint ink stains on his fingers. He's not a remarkable man in any obvious sense. He rents a one-bedroom apartment, takes the bus to work, calls his mother on Sundays, and worries about the rising cost of groceries. Most of the time, his days are ordinary in a way that blurs them together. Wake up, boil water for tea, scroll through the news without really reading it, throw on the same jacket, lock the same door, hurry to the same bus stop. He is not ungrateful for his life, but it's quiet, predictable, a little worn around the edges. There are, however, small details that don't show on the surface. When he was a boy, his family lived in a cramped apartment where the walls were too thin to hide arguments. He remembers nights when voices rose in the neighboring unit and nobody did anything. He remembers very clearly the time he watched a woman with a bruised cheek take her groceries up the stairs, eyes down, while the hallway turned politely away from her. Those scenes sank into him, not as dramatic trauma, but as a quiet lesson. Sometimes the worst pain is the kind people pretend not to see. Years later, long after he moved out and built his small, solitary life, his younger cousin showed him a short video on her phone. It was about a hand signal, palm out, thumb tucked in, fingers folding down, that people could use to wordlessly ask for help if they were trapped in a dangerous situation. It started during the pandemic, she said, when so many people were stuck at home in unsafe places. The idea was simple. If you couldn't say the words, you could still say them with your hand. Armin watched the video twice, then mimicked the gesture. Palm out, thumb in, fingers down. He felt a slight, unexpected heaviness in his chest. He thought of thin walls and quiet hallways and all the years when there hadn't been any secret code he knew of, no shared sign that said, "I need you to see me right now." He didn't imagine himself ever needing it, but he filed it away in the back of his mind without really knowing why. Months passed. The hand signal became one of those tiny things you think you'll forget, but don't. On the day this story takes place, the city was cold in that way late autumn sometimes is. Not beautiful yet, not winter yet, just gray. The air carried a thin, damp chill that slipped under scarves and through gloves. People moved a little faster, shoulders hunched, hands in pockets. The sky looked like someone had smudged white chalk across a steel surface and left it at that. Armin's morning had been unremarkable. A small argument with the photocopier, a coffee that tasted slightly burnt, a customer who wanted something more blue but not that blue and couldn't quite explain what she meant. By the time his shift ended, his shoulders ached and his head felt dull. He wrapped his scarf once around his neck, pulled his jacket tighter, and stepped out into the chill. His bus stop was 3 blocks away at the corner where a bakery and a discount clothing store shared a wall. He walked slowly, not in a rush to stand still in the cold. The streets were busy but not chaotic, people weaving past each other, cars idling at lights, a cyclist hunched low against the wind. He nodded a small hello to the bakery owner, who was already sweeping up crumbs near the door. When he reached the bus stop, the digital sign said the next bus would arrive in 4 minutes. He checked his phone out of habit. 5 unread messages in the family group chat, a headline about rising rents, weather warnings he'd already felt on his skin. He put the phone away and looked up. He has always been something of a watcher. Not in a prying way, but in that half-distracted, half-curious way people who commute alone sometimes are. He notices shoes, hands, the way people hold themselves. A teenager shifting his weight from foot to foot, practicing some unseen internal rhythm. An older woman adjusting her scarf with fingers that tremble slightly. A couple arguing softly, faces tight, voices low. Fragmented lives passing in front of him like clips from unfinished films. The bus arrived with a sigh of brakes and a small cloud of exhaust. People shuffled forward. Armin tapped his pass, nodded to the driver, and moved toward the middle of the bus, one hand on the rail as the vehicle pulled away from the curb. It was early evening, the kind of not quite rush hour where almost every seat was taken, but there was still standing room down the aisle. He found a place near the second set of doors, gripping the metal pole lightly, feet set wide for balance. He took in the familiar bus sounds, the hum of the engine, the faint rattle of windows, someone's headphones leaking a thin beat, the murmur of 2 friends discussing homework. The overhead lights made everything look a little flatter, but they also brought faces into clear relief. At the next stop, a man and a young girl got on. The man looked to be in his mid-30s. Dark jacket, jeans, a beanie pulled low over his forehead. He guided the girl ahead of him with a hand placed lightly between her shoulder blades. She was small, maybe 8 or 9, Armin guessed, with a pink backpack almost as big as her torso. Her hair was pulled back into a slightly crooked ponytail, like someone had done it in a hurry. She wore a pale blue coat that was buttoned wrong, one side higher than the other. They moved past Armin toward an empty double seat a few rows ahead. The man sat in the aisle seat. The girl slid in next to the window. Nothing about this was out of the ordinary. You see adults guiding children onto buses every day. The man wasn't yelling. He wasn't grabbing her. To most eyes, it was just another snapshot from city life. A man taking a girl somewhere. Armin might not have noticed them again if it hadn't been for the girl's hands. He caught it at first as a kind of tension in the way she sat. Her body leaned slightly away from the man, pressed closer to the window as if she wanted to blur into it. Her shoulders were pulled in, made smaller, like she was trying to occupy as little space as possible. When the bus jolted over a pothole, she flinched more than the motion required. The man leaned toward her a bit and said something Armin couldn't hear over the engine. The girl nodded, eyes down, her small hands gripping the edge of her backpack on her lap. There was nothing obvious to point to. No raised voice, no visible bruises, no dramatic scene. Just a quiet stiffness in a child's posture and the vague sense that the air around their seat felt heavier than the rest of the bus. It could have been nothing, it often is. The bus rolled on. People got off, people got on. Someone maneuvered a stroller into the open space near the door. The driver called out a stop name. A teenager laughed too loudly at something on his phone. Life went on in its usual, indifferent way. Armin's eyes returned to the girl almost without his choosing. She had shifted slightly. Her left shoulder was now more in his line of sight. Her small fingers had loosened on the backpack strap and were now resting on top of it. Her gaze wandered away from the window, down the aisle, over the faces and jackets and bags. Her eyes slipped past him, then returned, as if checking whether someone was actually looking back. For a brief second, their eyes met. There was something in her expression, not panic exactly, but a held-back plea, like someone standing in a doorway with a question they're afraid to ask out loud. Then her eyes flicked down to her own hand. She lifted it slowly, almost casually, as if adjusting something on her bag. Her palm turned outward just enough that he could see it. For anyone not paying attention, it would have looked like nothing. A child fidgeting, a meaningless movement. But Armin's mind, without warning, reached back months to that short video on his cousin's phone. Palm out, thumb in, fingers down. He watched, his own hand tightening around the pole. The girl's thumb folded across her palm, quick and small. Then her other fingers folded down over it, closing like a curtain. Open hand, thumb in, fingers down. It was shaky, imperfect, the way a child might do something they only half remembered. But the shape was there. The sequence was there. She repeated it lower this time, half hidden by the backpack. Palm, thumb, fold. Once. Twice. Her eyes stayed mostly down, but every few seconds they flicked up toward him, fast and uncertain, like she was afraid she'd done something wrong and equally afraid that nobody had noticed at all. The man beside her was looking at his phone. On the long list of moments that make up a life, this one lasted only a few seconds. An almost invisible hand gesture on a crowded bus. A grown man staring a little too intently at a child he didn't know. The space between thinking, is that what I think it is? And deciding, I can't ignore this. Armin felt a quiet but undeniable shift inside himself, something like a line being drawn. That old memory of thin apartment walls, of adults pretending not to hear, moved up from the background of his mind. Another, more recent memory surfaced too. His cousin's voice saying, "If you ever see someone do this, you don't just brush it off, okay? It might be the only thing they can do." He did not feel heroic. He felt a small, careful fear of being wrong, of misreading, of making a scene where there wasn't one. But layered under that was something steadier. The knowledge that if he did nothing and she really was asking for help, he would have to live with that silence afterward. He didn't wait to think it all the way through. He shifted his grip on the pole, then moved down the aisle toward the front of the bus, as if he had simply decided to stand somewhere else. He passed the girl's seat without looking directly at her face again, not wanting to draw attention. At the front, near the driver, there was a small sign. "For emergencies, please speak to the driver." It was the sort of sign most people never actually use. He stepped closer to the yellow line that marked the front area. The driver, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a neon safety vest over her uniform, glanced at him in the mirror. "Yeah," she said over the engine noise, not unkindly, but with the guarded patience of someone who has heard every possible complaint about air conditioning and missed stops. Armin leaned, in just enough so that his voice wouldn't carry to the rest of the bus. I'm not sure," he began, surprising himself with how unsteady his voice sounded. "But I think there might be a child in trouble back there." The driver's eyes sharpened a little. "What kind of trouble?" she asked, still watching the road. "There's a man with a young girl about 8 or 9, Armin said, keeping his words simple. "She just gave what looked like the hand signal for help. You know, the one." He made the gesture quickly at his chest where only the driver could see. Palm, thumb, fingers down. Her brow furrowed. She looked back at him through the mirror more fully now. "You sure?" she asked. "No," he said honestly. "I'm not sure, but I don't want to ignore it." The driver was quiet for half a second, hands steady on the wheel. She had been driving buses long enough to have heard dozens of false alarms, but she also knew what it meant to be the only official adult in a moving metal box. "Okay," she said finally, "stay up here." Her right hand slid down to press a small button on the dash, one that didn't ring a bell or flash a sign, but sent a coded alert to the transit control center. She spoke in a low, practiced voice into the radio clipped near her shoulder, giving the route number, location, and a brief message. "Possible child in distress. Requesting police meet at next major stop." Her tone was calm, almost routine, but Armin could hear something tighten around the edges. He felt his heart beat a little faster. The bus continued along its route, nothing outwardly changed. No sudden stop, no sirens. Most passengers remained absorbed in their own bubbles of music and conversation and scrolling screens. The city through the window rolled by, a laundromat, a closed-up cafe, a crosswalk blinking red. When he risked a glance back, the girl was looking straight ahead, face blank, hands folded on her lap. The man beside her was still on his phone, thumb moving up and down the screen. There was no way to tell if he had noticed Armin's quiet conversation with the driver. A few stops later, the bus slowed more than usual as it approached a busy intersection where multiple routes crossed. Armin could see, through the smeared front windshield, Two police cars parked slightly off to the side, their lights not yet flashing. Two officers stood near the curb, talking to each other, looking up as the bus pulled in. The driver opened the front doors, but kept the rear doors closed for a few extra seconds. She turned in her seat, her voice level but a little louder than usual. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "we're just going to pause here for a quick transit check. Please remain on the bus unless instructed otherwise." There was a murmur of mild annoyance, the low sigh that comes when a commute is interrupted. The officers stepped on board. One began walking down the aisle slowly, eyes scanning, while the other stayed near the front speaking quietly with the driver. In situations like this, people tend to become suddenly very interested in their shoes or their phones. The air thickened with a mix of curiosity and avoidance. Nobody wanted to be the center of whatever this was. Armin felt a strange mixture of visible and invisible. He knew that, in a way, he had set this in motion, but he also knew that his part was now mostly done. He stood near the driver, hands in his pockets, trying to look as unremarkable as he actually was. The officer walking down the aisle paused near the seat where the man and the girl sat. "Sir," the officer said evenly, "can I ask where you and the young lady are headed today?" The man looked up, clearly surprised at being addressed. "Home," he said. "Why?" "Is she your daughter?" the officer asked. The girl's eyes flicked between them, wide but cautious. "Yes," the man replied, his voice a touch defensive now. "Is there a problem?" The officer's posture remained relaxed. Nothing about his tone was aggressive, but there was a precision to his questions that suggested he'd done this before. "Can I ask her name?" he said, this time directing the question gently toward the girl. She hesitated. The man answered for her. "Her name is Layla," he said quickly. "We're just going home from the community center." The officer's gaze stayed on the girl. "Layla," he repeated, testing the word. "Is that right?" She opened her mouth, closed it again, then nodded faintly. Her hands had tightened on the strap of her backpack once more. "Could I see some ID from you, sir?" the officer asked the man, his tone still courteous. "What is this?" the man said, shifting in his seat. "We're just riding the bus." "I understand," the officer replied. "We've just had a report of a possible child in distress. I'm sure it's nothing, but we need to check. If you could just show me something with your name on it." The word distress seemed to hover in the air for a second. The man's jaw tightened. He reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out a worn wallet. As he did, the girl's eyes darted toward the front of the bus. For the briefest moment, they met Armin's again. There was a flicker there, fear, confusion, and something like cautious relief all tangled together. What happened next unfolded not in a flash of drama, but in a series of quiet, procedural steps. The officer glanced at the ID, asked a few more questions, address, relationship, where they'd been. He radioed something, listening to a reply crackle back. The other officer gently asked the girl if she'd be willing to step off the bus with them for a minute, just to chat. She looked at the man, then at the officer. After a beat, she nodded and slid off the seat. Her backpack straps creaked slightly with the movement. She walked the few steps toward the front of the bus, small boots making soft sounds on the rubber floor. Armin stepped slightly back to give her space. As she passed, barely at his hip height, she looked up at him for real this time. There was no dramatic gratitude in her expression, no cinematic, tearful smile. Just a kind of tired, serious acknowledgement, as if she was seeing, perhaps for the first time that day, that an adult had noticed her without being told to. Outside, near the bus's front door, one officer knelt down to her eye level while the other stood a short distance away, keeping an eye on the man, who remained seated, now more visibly uneasy. There were more questions, more radio calls. After a few minutes, the decision was made. Both the man and the girl would be taken down to the station to sort things out properly. On the bus, the tension began to loosen. Passengers shifted, exhaled. Some looked openly curious now, others rolled their eyes, a few simply went back to their screens. The driver received a brief nod from the officer, then turned back to her controls. "All right, folks," she announced. "Thanks for your patience. We'll be continuing on the route now." As the officers escorted the man and the girl off the bus, Armin stayed where he was, eyes lowered. He did not want to be part of whatever story the man might tell about this moment. He did not want to be seen as accuser or hero. He simply wanted the bus doors to close gently behind them. Before the girl stepped fully onto the sidewalk, she turned her head a fraction. Her hand, still by her side, opened and closed once, not in the precise gesture from before, but in a small, uncertain wave. It might have been meant for him. It might have been a reflex. He raised his own hand slightly in response, fingers barely lifting from his side. The doors hissed shut. As the bus pulled away, Armin watched the figures on the sidewalk grow smaller through the streaked glass. The two officers, the man's tense shoulders, the girl's blue coat. Eventually, they blurred into the general cityscape and were gone. Nobody on the bus asked him what had happened. Nobody clapped, nobody thanked him, nobody gave any indication that they knew he'd played a role in this quiet disruption. Life on board slid quickly back into its default state, headphones in, eyes down, hands scrolling. Within 5 minutes, the interruption was just another story some of them might half mention later. There was some kind of police thing on my bus today, and then forget. For Armin, though, the evening felt slightly altered. He got off 3 stops later, as usual. The sky was a little darker now, the air a little colder. He walked the familiar path to his apartment building, his feet moving on well-known cracks in the pavement. The laundromat on the corner buzzed softly. A nearby restaurant's exhaust fan pushed out the smell of fried onions. The ordinary city sounds were all the same, but there was a quiet hum under his skin, a small awareness that something had been different today. Inside his apartment, he kicked off his shoes, hung his jacket on its usual hook, and filled the kettle with water. The routine steadied him. He turned on the small kitchen radio out of habit. A calm voice discussed traffic updates. No mention of a bus, a hand signal, or a little girl in a blue coat. Somewhere, other officers were now taking statements, making phone calls, checking records. Somewhere, that situation was either deepening into something serious or being sorted out as a misunderstanding with precautionary caution. He didn't know which. He might never know. He sat at his small table with a cup of tea cooling between his hands. The steam rose, then faded. He replayed the bus scene in his mind, testing it from different angles. Had he overreacted? Had he imagined the gesture? Had he made trouble for a family that simply didn't wear its closeness on the surface? He thought of the girl's eyes, the way she'd checked and rechecked if someone was looking. He thought of her small hand forming that awkward but intentional signal. He thought of the slight drop of her shoulders when the officer had invited her to step off the bus. There had been something like release in that movement, even if it was wrapped in fear. He exhaled slowly and let himself accept the fact that there was no perfect clarity to be had. In the bus, he had done what felt, in that moment, most honest to his conscience. He had chosen, for that brief sliver of time, not to be the adult pretending not to hear, not to see. Later that week, on a quieter evening, he mentioned the incident to his cousin when they met for coffee. "You remember that hand signal thing you showed me?" he asked. She raised her eyebrows. "Yeah, why?" "I think I saw a girl use it," he said, telling the story in plain, unembellished terms. He didn't dramatize, didn't add details that weren't there. Just a bus, a gesture, a conversation with a driver, the arrival of the police. His cousin listened, her hands wrapped around her own coffee cup. "You did the right thing," she said when he finished. "Even if it was nothing, you did the right thing." He nodded, staring at a small chip in the table's surface. "I keep wondering if I embarrassed them," he admitted. "The man and the girl, if maybe he really was her father and just doesn't look like he is." "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe you gave her proof that the signal works, that someone out there knows it and cares enough to act. Sometimes that's as important as the outcome." He hadn't considered that. The idea settled inside him with a gentle weight. Days turned into weeks. Armin's life slipped back into its grooves, printing orders, bus rides, tea at his small table. Winter came properly then, with snow that softened the harsh lines of the city. The bus windows fogged up more. People wore thicker coats and thicker expressions. The memory of that particular evening didn't dominate his thoughts, but it also never completely left. Every now and then, when he saw a child on the bus, he found himself watching their hands a little more closely. Not in a vigilant, paranoid way, just with an awareness he hadn't had before. The world around him was still full of noise, of people in a hurry, of stories he'd never know. But somewhere inside that noise, he knew, were small signals waiting to be seen. In another part of the world, or perhaps in the same city on a different day, someone was sharing another story about Keanu Reeves, about a quiet kindness, a noticed stranger, a small sacrifice made with no fanfare. Those stories circulate because they comfort us. They assure us that even among the famous, there are people who respond when the world whispers instead of shouts. But as much as we enjoy those tales, they can create a strange distance if we're not careful. It's easy to tuck goodness into the category of the exceptional, to think, that's just how he is. He's different. I'm not like that. It can make kindness feel like a trait reserved for a particular, rare kind of person. The truth is much quieter than that. Most of the time, kindness doesn't look like a grand gesture made by someone whose face is on movie posters. It looks like a tired bus driver pressing a small button and trusting a stranger's uncertain instinct. It looks like a man with ink-stained fingers choosing to walk to the front of the bus instead of staying where it's comfortable. It looks like a little girl, scared but brave enough to move her hand in a way she hopes someone will understand. There are no headlines about what happened on that bus. No viral video, no trending hashtags. The story exists mostly in the minds of a few people: the girl, the officers, the driver, and Armin. It sits alongside countless other untold stories. A teacher who notices a student growing quieter each week, a neighbor who knocks on a door when they hear too much silence, a commuter who stays on a train one extra stop to walk someone to a lit station exit. When we talk about kindness and courage, it's tempting to look up, to the screens, to the famous names, to the people whose lives seem larger than ours. But the heart of it lives on regular buses and in cramped kitchens and along gray sidewalks at the end of long workdays. It lives in those small, often uncomfortable choices to trust the quiet alarm bell inside us and to act on it before it fades. Keanu Reeves will probably continue to have small stories told about him, and maybe that's a good thing. They remind us that decency can survive exposure and success. But somewhere in the same cities where people go to his movies, there are also thousands of Armin-like figures whose names we don't know, who will never be recognized beyond their immediate circles. They may not look like heroes. They may never be completely sure they did the right thing. They may go home afterward to small apartments and cooling cups of tea. Yet, when a little hand in a crowded space quietly asks for help, they turn toward it instead of away. And in that simple, unremarkable movement, one ordinary person not waiting a second longer than necessary, lives the same human meaning we admire in the famous stories. It's a reminder that the goodness we hope to see in others is already here among us, often sitting just a few seats away, watching carefully, ready to respond when someone finally dares to ask to be seen.